Mark Antony barely clawed his way out of Parthian-held territory and crossed into Armenia, then countered among Rome's allies. Furious that King Artavasdes had abandoned him, he held his tongue. Antony was in urgent need of the provisions the Armenians held. The battered legions lingered there, yet food remained scarce, and by midwinter he had to press on to Syria, where Cleopatra, Pharaoh of Egypt, had stationed herself with ample provisions and gifts. The winter route was merciless. On the way to Syria, Antony lost another 8,000 of his soldiers due to snow and blizzards. With this, Roman casualties reached 42,000, almost equal to the entire force Crassus had. Upon reaching Syria, Antony, in an effort to appease his troops, distributed valuable gifts among them. Across the lines, Parthia squandered its great victory. Quarrels over the spoils erupted between King Phraates IV and the ruler of Media Atropatene, flaring into open conflict. The Median king secretly appealed Antony for help, but his exhausted legions could not launch another campaign, so he postponed negotiations until the following year. In 34 BC, bolstered by 2 fresh legions from Octavian, Antony marched back into Armenia. Through deft intrigue, he seized Artavasdes, shipped him to Alexandria, and placed his own son, Alexander Helios, on the throne. Artavasdes' heir, Artaxias, fled to Phraates, binding Parthia and Armenia together against Rome alongside Media. Meanwhile, Italy was in upheaval. In 36 BC, as Antony fought in the east, Octavian and Lepidus invaded Sicily, crushed Sextus Pompey, and then fell out. Lepidus tried to claim the island, but his troops deserted to Octavian, forcing him to surrender. Lepidus's provinces and legions passed to Octavian, leaving only Antony as a rival. Octavian pounced, portraying Antony's liaison with Cleopatra as scandalous and his Parthian setback as disgraceful. Antony rushed envoys to Rome to defend him, yet the collision grew ever closer. News from Italy unnerved Antony. His modest gains against the Parthians meant little while their armies still ranged unbroken, so he abandoned the grinding Eastern War and hurried back to Syria with every available force. From there, he dispatched lieutenants to court allies in the Senate and the streets of Rome. Early in 31 BC, the showdown began. At Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's fleet suffered a crushing defeat, and Octavian pursued them to Alexandria, finishing their forces in 30 BC. The doomed lovers took their own lives, and all republican power fell into Octavian's hands. In 27 BC, he assumed the title Augustus, trimmed the Senate's authority, and refashioned Rome from republic to empire, with himself as its first emperor. Parthia wrestled with its own turmoil. After Antony quit Armenia, Phraates swiftly subdued Atropatene, re-annexed it, invaded Armenia, and set Artaxias on the throne as a client king. He was preparing to drive the Romans even farther back when, in 31 BC, just as Antony and Octavian clashed, a noble named Tiridates rose in rebellion against him. Phraates quit Armenia in haste to confront his challenger. Tiridates, buoyed by several Parthian nobles and open Roman backing, routed him in 30 BC and drove him east. Stripped of allies, Phraates sought refuge with the eminent house of Suren in Sistan. Yet another moment when the Sistanes proved decisive in Parthian politics. With their aid, he struck back, defeating Tiridates in 29 BC. though the rebel escaped, kidnapping Phraates' younger son and spiriting him to Syria. The king immediately dispatched envoys to Rome, demanding the child's return and the surrender of Tiridates. Augustus returned the princes, but refused to hand over the rebel. While talks dragged on, Phraates marched south against the kingdom of Characene, crushing its upstart ruler and restoring Parthian authority. In 26 BC, Tiridates counterattacked, bursting into Mesopotamia. Caught off guard, Phraates abandoned his capital, but by the following year, he had reclaimed the region, only to face a new usurper, Mithridates, who would cling to power until 9 BC. Parthia was so racked by upheaval that Augustus himself moved east. Sensing an opening to avenge Rome's past disasters, Augustus arrived in Syria in 20 BC. He dispatched his adopted son with crack legions to seize Armenia. Unable to resist, the kingdom capitulated and again fell under Roman sway. A two-pronged invasion of Parthia seemed imminent. Beset by Mithridates' revolt and acutely aware of his peril, Phraates chose conciliation. He surrendered the Roman standards captured in earlier wars, ending 3 decades of grinding conflict before it consumed his realm. Augustus spun this diplomatic coup into triumph. He paraded the restored eagles as proof of a decisive victory, boasting that Parthia had been humbled and reduced to a client. In truth, the capitulation yielded little beyond propaganda, but it burnished his image as conqueror of the Parthians. In return for Phraates' goodwill, Augustus sent him an Italian concubine named Musa, whose arrival would upend Parthian succession. She swiftly captivated the aging monarch and convinced him to name their son, young Phraates, as heir. To clear the path, she urged him to dispatch his older sons to Rome. Surprisingly, Phraates complied. Augustus displayed the princes as royal hostages, gaining both prestige and leverage over Parthian affairs. When Musa was assured of her son's succession, she poisoned the aging Parthian king. Thus, in 2 BC, Phraates ascended the throne as Phraates V, succeeding his father. Around the same time, the question of kingship in Armenia escalated tensions between the Parthian Empire and Rome. Phraates V sent an army into Armenia and succeeded in defeating the pro-Roman faction, placing Tigranes IV on the Armenian throne. This development displeased Augustus. In 1 BC, he sent a letter to the Parthian king, expressing his dissatisfaction. The following year, Augustus dispatched Gaius Caesar to Syria with a large force. In 1 AD, the first stage of negotiations between Phraates V and Gaius Caesar began. Both parties convened on an island located near the Euphrates River. While in earlier correspondence, the two sides had refrained from using royal titles when addressing each other, this time the tone of the negotiations was more respectful. Phraates addressed Octavian as Augustus, while the Roman side referred to Phraates as Shahanshah, King of Kings. Both parties agreed on maintaining Tigranes' rule in Armenia, which was supported by the Parthians. However, Tigranes' sudden death during the negotiations complicated matters. At Augustus's suggestion, Ariobarzanes, king of Media Atropatene, was appointed king of Armenia as well. Ariobarzanes' pro-Roman stance made him an unsuitable candidate in the eyes of the Parthians, but Phraates, uncertain about the internal situation of his own empire, had no choice but to accept. Augustus also refused Phraates' repeated requests to return the Parthian princes held in Rome. Phraates accepted the terms of peace, and thus the war formally ended between the two powers. However, the peace was fragile. Although the two empires avoided direct military confrontation for the next 50 years, competition over influence in Armenia continued. Ariobarzanes' rule in Armenia was not accepted by the local population, which opened the door for Parthian interference in Armenian affairs. Meanwhile, the Romans also sought to install their preferred candidate on the throne, and this ongoing rivalry led to increasing instability in Armenia. It wasn't long before the Armenian issue ignited another full-scale war between the Romans and the Parthians. The First Roman-Parthian War, which had begun in 54 BC with Crassus's crossing of the Euphrates, came to a temporary end in 1 AD. Although the two powers had come to recognize one another as equals, they continued to vie for influence in the region. The First Roman-Parthian War had no decisive outcome for either side. When the conflict officially ended in 1 AD, the political landscape of the region was not much different from what it had been in 54 BC when the war had begun. Still, the war left a lasting impact. The death of Crassus and the defeat of Mark Antony undeniably shaped Rome's internal political developments, even if the full extent of that impact is hard to quantify. On the other hand, the deportation of Parthian princes to Rome gave the Romans a unique opportunity to exacerbate the instability within the Parthian Empire following the death of Phraates IV, thereby securing their eastern frontier from Parthian incursions for nearly half a century. And so concludes the First War between Rome and Parthia. If you're interested in the Roman-Parthian conflicts, make sure to subscribe as we continue to recreate the clashes between these two great powers.